Miami, also known as the Magic City, is home to over 470,000 people, and Miami-Dade County, the most populous county in Florida, is home to over 2.7 million people. When anyone thinks of South Beach and the Sunshine State, they reminisce on images of movie stars and wealthy billionaires living life basking in the warm sunshine. However, deep below the surface of this magic city lays the real reality of Miami, the vulnerable side of the magic city. It's a climate change catastrophe that's unraveling right before our eyes with every passing hurricane season, and the signs are on the wall that the situation is going to get a lot worse. Miami is the most vulnerable coastal city in the world, yet relatively few people are talking about the serious threat that is facing the state of Florida as a whole and its thousands of miles of white sand coastline. Welcome to a documentary about Miami's climate change catastrophe and Operation Resilience, the city's response to climate change and what it means to the residents of the Magic City. My name is Wade LaGrenade, an engineer with a strong interest in climate change and climatology, and I'm your narrator for this short film. For the most part, most people in Miami live just 3 feet above sea level, and as rising seas and climate change is escalating the relocation of many residents, especially on islands in the Pacific and other remote islands, the situation in Miami is getting worse with each passing of the hurricane season. So what is really at stake here? Well, the trillion-dollar economy in Florida to start, and then when you factor in over 140 billion in real estate value in Miami-Dade County alone and the increased rates of mortality due to climate change over the next 4 years, well, there is a lot at stake. Residents of Miami are feeling the effects of storm surges that breach the wall of downtown Miami, that leave lots of cars stranded in the roads, and the flooding of low-lying mobile home parks after this thunderstorm. As climate change may contribute to these factors, the native wildlife is encroaching into residential areas with more frequency, putting lives at risk. Many scientists have testified that we need to take policies that are going to be able to reduce our carbon footprint in an effort to reduce the effect of global warming on the city of Miami. However, many scientists feel that it might be too late for the Magic City. By the year 2050, over 500,000 people living in South Florida could experience massive flooding that forces them to move and relocate and retreat inland or leave Florida altogether. For anyone living 3 feet above current water levels, they may need to abandon their homes as a chronic fatigue from king tides and massive flooding from otherwise modest storms may begin to take its toll on their physical and emotional being, and they may have no other choice but to abandon their homes and become exiles of climate change. As a society, we have made great strides to shift our dependence away from coal to natural gas and develop cars that burn cleaner and more efficiently. However, there's no denying the vulnerability of Miami, the Magic City, and the impact of stronger and stronger hurricanes, rising seas, and a whole host of other problems associated with the high level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We have to face the fact that by 2040 and 2050, rising seas in Miami will have a devastating effect on life, as most residents of Miami currently know it. It is costly to address climate change. However, the burden of not addressing it head-on becomes heavily, especially in coastal cities such as Miami, very low ground level water supplies and very high population density. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that something is a little off with the Earth's atmosphere by looking at the wickedly active 2020 hurricane season. If we review the Atlantic hurricane activity from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, for 2020 up to November 8th, 2020, we see that we have had 28 named storms with 104 named storm days and 12 hurricanes. We've had 5 major hurricanes so far this season. We've been running out of conventional names and resorting to Greek group alphabet to name storms with just a little less than a month still left in the 2020 hurricane season. This season is 240% more than the average from 1981 to 2010 for named storms, and about 200% of the average for hurricanes in the same average period. Scientists have been warning us that as the sea surface temperatures of the Gulf of Mexico continue to rise just a few fractions of a degree or more Celsius, combined with rising sea levels worldwide, we're in for more severe hurricanes with increased frequency and more devastating effects of storm surge, king tide, death by flood, and much more. Now that we have concrete data, we need to take a close look at a serious situation in Miami, because when it rains heavy in most parts of South Florida, it floods. Climate change is real in Miami, especially in Miami Beach, which is destined to face the most serious brunt of climate change. The sea level has risen by 7 to 8 centimeters since 1992 and is expected to rise much more by the year 2050. Miami is in the heart of former swampland that is just slightly above sea level, and it makes it the most vulnerable coastal city worldwide when it comes to climate change. Most tourists witness something amazing when it rains very heavy on Miami Beach. The drains are struggling to deal with the flood water, and it almost appears as if the water is seeping up from below the ground to flood the streets when it's raining. It makes logical sense. Miami stands on porous limestone, and the sea is rising faster in South Florida than most places worldwide, and the king tides are becoming more and more destructive with each passing year. Drain outlets have become a source of jokes for residents because they seem to stop working altogether. These drain outlets are below high tide level during the surges. The limestone is a major problem because it acts like a sponge, and the rising sea level becomes more of a situation of contamination for the city's freshwater sources, especially in Miami-Dade County and Broward County. When the seawater breaches this limestone, it compromises the area's freshwater aquifers and also septic tanks. The local government authority in South Florida keeps applying small patches here and there to try and stay one step ahead of flood and surge events, like erecting ever higher sea level walls and literally raising some streets in mostly prominent wealthy neighborhoods in Miami Beach. Yet as more freshwater wells are contaminated by seawater breaches, Floridians are going to have to face another effect of climate change catastrophe, running out of fresh drinking water even while the streets are flooded. We've seen the obvious stats that the South Florida region is in serious trouble. Rising sea temperatures, especially in the Gulf of Mexico, is going to make the region's hurricanes much longer and far more destructive than in previous years. And with that comes the threat of billions of dollars in destruction and property damage, not to mention a serious threat to and loss of life. Residents who live in areas such as Key Biscayne and other island towns in the area of Miami and Miami Beach are going to have to make serious considerations as to how they intend to stay in their homes. Many residents are trying to raise their homes to combat the threat of tidal surge and flooding, but it's very expensive. One of the main problems in Miami is the septic tank system. There are thousands of homes with septic tanks in the Miami area, and the impact fee of $10,000 to $25,000 and more per home to access a newly proposed multi-billion-dollar sewer system is quite out of reach for most residents of Miami. While the average net worth of a white non-Latinx resident is above $100,000, income equality starts to show its ugly face once again in 2020 as the average wealth of a Miami Cuba resident is 4 to 5 times less than their white non-Latinx residents. There is an ugly elephant in the room that the Miami City Council is not addressing. If the median household income in Miami is around $50,000 and most people in Miami are rent burdened, where they allocate 70% to 75% of their income towards basic rent, how are the residents of Miami going to be able to afford the weather shocks of the next direct hit Category 4 hurricane on their livelihood and loss of personal property? You can only raise the streets and potentially raise your home so many feet above sea level before you realize that resistance to imminent tidal surges, flooding, and weather anomalies packing Category 5 winds is futile. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, with an annual budget of approximately $18 billion, is really designed to respond to many of these natural disasters. Many people impacted by these disasters often reach out to FEMA for a loan or grant to replace a damaged car or personal property. In theory, FEMA is just a one-stop for natural disasters in the United States. However, as hurricanes become more frequent and more destructive, the burden on FEMA will become even more severe. One of the best case studies to date of a Category 5 hurricane and its impact on South Florida is Hurricane Irma in 2017. Irma caused the displacement of hundreds and hundreds of residents in the Florida Keys area who lived in vulnerable areas right on the water. Yes, Florida Keys is the picture of paradise, but at what cost? The cost to cover the level of destruction from Hurricane Irma is too much to bear for FEMA, with billions of dollars in property loss from the effects of this strong hurricane. If we examine the true cost and level of destruction of a Category 5 hurricane making a direct hit on the city of Miami, the loss would be in the billions. With 2020 being noted as the most active hurricane season to date, with the formation of Tropical Storm Theta, the people of Miami really need to think long and hard on the pending calamity of a major hurricane making a direct hit in the area and what it means to the most important investment in the average resident of Miami in their personal portfolio, their home. Climate change is real and it's here to stay. We have to face reality and limit our personal exposure. For the average resident of Miami, their wealth is tied up in their home. What is going to happen when the occurrence of more severe weather causing more impactful damage, such as the loss of a roof or damage to the foundation of the home from flying debris at 165 miles per hour? Can the residents of Miami afford the cost of insurance premiums as Miami bears the burden of climate change? What about the banks? Do you think the banks are going to finance a 30-year mortgage in a hot zone that is prone to frequent Category 5 hurricanes and tidal flood surge and catastrophic wind damage? If you're one of those Miami residents whose net worth is significantly tied up into your home, just take a look at the spaghetti models of major storms of 2020. There's absolutely nothing preventing the track of an eye of a Category 5 hurricane with all of its devastating power to rip through the heart of downtown Miami and the surrounding 34 incorporated cities in the Miami-Dade County area and leave a path of destruction in the billions. There's no force field above the city to deflect the winds or a secret dome of energy of some sort to protect the homes from being picked up by the winds and thrown into the Atlantic Ocean, like in the late 2017 with Hurricane Irma in the Florida Keys. If there's one thing we learned about Miami's history, we can reflect on the damage of Hurricane Andrew in 1992 and the $50 billion in adjusted 2017 dollars in damage it caused. Most people who lived in South Florida at the time are still haunted by the loss of 61 people to Hurricane Andrew, the costliest hurricane in United States history at the time, only to be outdone by the Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and Hurricane Sandy in 2012. Since the Labor Day hurricane of 1935, most Florida officials believe that it was the worst hurricane to make direct impact in the Miami area, with some 500 million in losses alone to boats and buildings from the storm surge, not to mention the catastrophic winds where it was believed to have had several F5 tornadoes touch down in a Homestead area when it hit in late August of 1992. It's only a matter of time before a Category 5 hurricane threatens the coast of South Florida with winds of 200 miles per hour or more. While these hurricanes take a huge toll on the residents of Miami, we have to take a closer look at what it will do to the economy and the long-term sustainability of people living in the area. Income and racial inequality contribute significantly to the ability of the residents of Miami to bear the burden of the next devastating hurricane to impact the region. People of color have on average a fifth of the wealth of their white non-Latinx neighborhoods. And this wealth inequality has gotten worse as the residents of the area have lost their jobs in the thousands as a result of the global pandemic of 2019 and 2020. Dwindling savings means less preparation and increased susceptibility to significant losses as a result of heavy flooding, tidal surge, and of course, the next Category 5 hurricane. Most climatologists agree that the intense activity of 2020 hurricane season that starts in June and ends in November has resulted in millions of dollars in property damage and loss of life along the Alabama and North Florida coasts. And the sea surface temperatures of the Gulf of Mexico continue to rise. Miami is smack in the center of the hurricane alley for storms that typically originate off the Cape Verde Islands and migrate to the U.S. mainland by way of Puerto Rico and Cuba. In 2017, South Florida got its wake-up call with very intense Category 5 hurricanes Irma and Maria that virtually destroyed Puerto Rico and the Florida Keys. With the high tide, the water seems to seep up from the ground in many areas of Miami Beach, so the residents are looking at higher ground, which is ironic because Florida is mostly flat. However, many residents of Miami Beach are selling their homes to limit their exposure to climate change and heading west. And it's driving out residents of mostly African American and Haitian American neighborhoods who witness on a daily basis the ramifications of what's called now climate gentrification in Miami. Little Haiti, which has been a main refuge for Haitian people fleeing the dictatorship of Papa Doc Duvalier and the pillage and plunder of the Tonton Macoute, Papa Doc's secret police unit that wreaked havoc in Haiti in the 1970s, is witnessing the brunt of this climate gentrification. Biscayne Bay and the Miami River have long been dividing lines of wealth and inequality in Miami for decades, and as the gravity of climate change starts to sink in for many of Miami's residents, they're trying to flee to higher ground, which in this case is only a few centimeters above sea level, to continue to live the magic city dream of paradise in the tropics. Developers are buying up land in impoverished neighborhoods of Little Haiti, Liberty City, Opelika, with the hope of profiting from the surge of wealthy residents fleeing from constantly flooding streets of Miami Beach. This situation is spawning a gross and heinous example of climate gentrification in Miami to date. Developers are profiting from landlords who are, without notice, raising rents 100% to 250% to force evictions of low-income and retired residents of Miami who have called the city home for decades, to give way to the development of white sugar-coated vanilla townhouses that lack any kind of semblance of the neighborhood that thousands of people of color call home. Many of the residents of Little Haiti and other neighborhoods are witnessing the complete erosion of their once thriving neighborhoods, rich with culture and folklore, as homeowners bow to the pressure of developers buying up land all around them to build multi-million-dollar townhouses that they know were never meant for the people there who call that neighborhood home. Developers want you to believe that they're improving the neighborhood with a small Senate by allocating a small percentage of units to what's called under a label affordable housing. However, with the bulk of their profits being derived from wealthy non-Latinx residents who are flocking in droves away from flood zone areas in Miami-Dade County to find refuge in Miami and higher land that amount to probably 2 meters to 4 meters above sea level. Developers have embarked on a 15-year billion-dollar project called the Magic City Innovation District to promote themselves as the revitalizers of the Miami economy and to protect its residents from climate change and storm surge. At the end of the day, Haitian activists have been able to witness a complete erosion of their neighborhood, that in the long run, black residents, many of whom who owned their own homes for years and years, are caving into the demands of developers all around them and are being priced out of their own neighborhoods. After 3 years of vigorous protesting and resistance to the corruption in Miami has become futile, as the city gave green light and signed off on the venture that only recently that capitalizes on Miami's revitalization, which always leaves people of color hanging by the wayside. The notion that things would be better for the residents of Miami is just a myth, the stuff of urban legend, because black and brown people of Miami have heard for years that their local government authorities are there and have their backs. Various nonprofits have been trying to convince people of color not to sell their most prized asset, where their investment is tied up into the value of their homes, to developers. But it's hard to turn down cash offers when they think they're getting a great deal. However, once the reality sets in that they can never afford to move back into their own neighborhoods and there's nothing else available in Miami, many people of color realize that their only option is to leave Miami and South Florida altogether and possibly flee to northern counties such as West Palm Beach or Palm Beach County or even the state of Georgia, thereby taking with them their culture and their folklore. The impact of climate gentrification is not only felt by Haitian people who fled Haiti in the 70s, but also African Americans in cities like Liberty City, where developers are buying up lots of land, and the price of real estate has risen as much as 30% in the last few years. As usual, the African American community most likely will not stand to gain from many of the wealth building benefits of these revitalization projects, especially when the average income of residents in these areas is under $20,000 a year. Many of the residents in Liberty City, a predominantly African American neighborhood, are already seeing the hallmark signs of climate gentrification. There are signs all along the way that something is coming. A local barbecue mom and pop shack gets replaced with a Starbucks. The small businesses in African American communities like Liberty City have always been much more than economic drivers of prosperity. They are also community stomping grounds for activism. Once these quaint-looking coffee shops move into African American neighborhoods, most of the residents know that big changes are coming and not for the betterment of their community. Activists will have their voice silenced by city council members who claim that they will bring jobs and economic revitalization to the area. However, African Americans know that the sliding scale of wealth and income inequality is starting to get worse. There's subliminal signs of gentrification that scream "get out," and they're screwed. The irony of all of it is that back in the 1960s, when redlining was common and African Americans were denied the opportunity to live on the coast by systematic and institutional racism, there was no other option but to call Liberty City and Little Haiti home. Now that climate change has become a major issue with rising seas, devastating tidal surge, and more frequent flooding in Miami Beach, once again, African Americans and Haitians are witnessing the last safe haven of their wealth evaporate to the favor of those residents who benefited and earned dividends from the legacy of decades of redlining and systematic racism against the black residents of Miami. No one's arguing that Miami is not the same city it once was in the 1960s, and it hasn't seen significant growth in the last 4 decades. However, in the year of the hashtag Black Lives Matter and the woke culture and the unraveling of the ravages and the effects of systematic and institutional racism in Miami's banking and regulatory policies, people of color are once again under attack in Miami. The city has become one of the most expensive places to live, often outpricing people of color who simply want to rent an apartment and pursue job opportunities or start a business. In just the last 10 years, rents have risen over 25% in Miami, while the salaries and affordable housing construction has remained stagnant especially for people of color. Luxury skyscrapers are going up every year, but they're not built for the people of Miami. Developers are catering to mostly wealthy out-of-towners who can afford to live there for a third of the year and board it up for the remaining portion of the year. These types of residents will never truly feel the brunt of climate change when it comes, yet they stand to profit the most from the growth of climate gentrification in Miami. What we're really witnessing in the Magic City is classic gentrification, and developers are simply trying to capitalize on the few inches of elevation and buy themselves 1 or 2 more real estate growth cycles before the whole real estate bubble bursts in Miami, and eventually banks will refuse to make 30-year mortgages in the area because the cost of flood insurance is simply not economically viable. Maybe there's some irony to all of this because black residents of Miami are being outpriced by accepting generous cash offers on their homes that they've owned for decades, and they have to face the reality that they will not be able to purchase another home in Miami. We have to face the reality that most of Miami will be underwater in about 100 years. So why not just take the money and run? Many people are selling their homes on Miami Beach and moving to other cities like Atlanta, Houston, and Denver. The middle class in Miami will continue to shrink and shrink as the telltale signs of income inequality will be written all over town. Insurance premiums will continue to rise along with the cost of rent, both skyrocketing and outpacing increases in salary. Sure, in 2020, the sales of luxury homes in Miami and Miami Beach are brisk, but most developers will tell you that they're simply trying to buy some time and profit as much as possible from 1 or 2 more growth cycles of Miami's real estate luxury market before the whole deck of cards comes crumbling down from the truly devastating effects of climate change that are yet to come. In a futile attempt to address the issue of climate change to the betterment of all Miami residents, developers have adopted what's called the Operation Resilience, a project to raise the streets and elevate buildings above the sea level. While it sounds ostentatious, but it's simply just a reflection of Miami's conspicuous consumption of the lifestyle of the rich and famous with complete disregard for Miami's diverse community at large. Some buildings are being designed to withstand a Category 5 hurricane, and they're being elevated 2 meters to 3 meters off the ground to withstand any threats of tidal surge and street flooding. Many of these units will be sold for millions and millions of dollars. So at the end of the day, the local government is not really concerned about the resilience of residents of Miami as a whole to be able to withstand the effects of climate change, but only a very small and very wealthy section of the community. It makes sense after all, since the wealthy are the only ones perhaps that the National Flood Insurance Program NFIP is still viable, as over half of their revenue reportedly comes from serving the very rich in Miami. Resilience is just a quick patch to conceal a very formidable threat to the people of Miami. Most activists are calling it the mental austerity for the rich. They're using resilience as a way to make themselves out to be conquistadors of the modern century, impermeable to the imminent trauma of climate change. The elevation of buildings sounds quite dandy. However, what happens when the local drinking water supply is unsafe? What happens when most of the streets are impassable for weeks and weeks on end due to floodwaters and the surge from a major hurricane? Over 35% of Miami's budget comes from property tax. So they have to cater to the rich and famous to finance the very same infrastructure that makes Operation Resilience happen on schedule anyway. Of course, once again, people of color are shut out completely. Operation Resilience has zero regard for the middle-class communities of Miami Beach, whether they're African American or members of the Latinx community, and many of them will be left to fend for themselves. Miami's Operation Resilience and its goal to raise the streets in predominantly very wealthy neighborhoods of luxury skyscrapers doesn't consider the loss of a functioning school system due to extreme flooding and property damage. Operation Resilience is simply an austerity tactic to cater to the rich and famous who continue to fund Miami's budget to ensure that their economic bubble thrives for at least one or two more so-called sustainable cycles. By building up the resistance to climate change for just a very select few, most of the people in the 34 incorporated cities of Miami-Dade County will be left to fend for themselves when the seawater rises and the septic tanks stop functioning and raw sewage starts to seep up from the potholes of downtown Miami and Miami Beach, and the fresh drinking water sources become so contaminated that the National Guard has to be mobilized. The new multi-million-dollar pump system that's been installed in Miami Beach will not be able to handle tens of millions of gallons of surging seawater that will inundate the water table during the next devastating Category 5 or Category 5 hurricane to hit the Miami area. The porous limestone that Miami was built on will become so saturated in the next climactic emergency that tidal surge water will have nowhere to go. No amount of resiliency will be able to shelter the majority of millions of residents of Miami in the near future. City officials will not be able to raise the entire city 2 meters or 3 meters above ground for what is going to be once going to face the city of Miami in all likelihood. Raising the city seawalls will only buy some time. However, if all indicators are current, the next Irma, like storms that hit Miami, most of Brickell will be 6 feet underwater with impassable streets and mounds of stranded cars floating in muddy debris. Residents flock to Miami for the ocean and the warm sunshine and to live the beach laptop lifestyle. But what happens when giant pumps designed to address climate change fail to work because there's no power? And if they don't work, What's going to pump millions of gallons of contaminated water away from the homes of residents of Miami? And where does this water go? Does it go back into the ocean and Biscayne Bay? No amount of mental austerity from Operation Resilience is going to allow us to escape the inevitable future of Miami. You have maybe 20 years, maybe 30 years before most people will have to retreat inland. Being that the Everglades occupies most of the western region of South Florida, time is up. There's nowhere to go except north to Orlando and southern Georgia and other inland states. Eventually, as the sea surface temperatures rise 1 or 2 more degrees Celsius in the Gulf of Mexico, it will not be out of the norm to brace for several 5 or 7 very intense Category 5 hurricanes along the Florida coastline and the Gulf Coast year after year. As the ravages of climate change intensify with each hurricane season, millions of coastline residents will eventually have to retreat to states like Nebraska and Oklahoma, Utah, and the Dakotas to escape the climate change ravages of rising sea levels. There's no amount of resilience that will offset the reality that by the year 2050, over 1 million residents of Miami will be displaced by rising seas and tidal surge. And the brutal and more frequent hurricanes that pack winds possibly up to 200 miles per hour and tidal surge of 10 to 15 inches of water year after year. The climactic stress on the infrastructure of Miami from the persistent assault of these types of flooding episodes would be too much to bear for the majority of Miami's residents, and they'll be forced to retreat to higher ground, perhaps the Carolinas and Georgia. Miami's smaller community of ultra-wealthy residents may hold out in their 3-meter elevated luxury high-rises, but what kind of life can you have when you spend your days barricaded in your own home? The fight for low-income communities, especially those of people of color, will intensify, and residents fight to hold out on their higher ground property as they fend off these vulture tactics of developers who cater to the whims of wealthy class and cave in to retreat to other regions of the United States far away from the coastlines of Florida. The harsh reality of it all is that a third of the homes are over over 25 billion in residential property in Miami-Dade is in serious risk of rising seas over the next 2 decades. As a result of decades of redlining and systematic racism, which is compounding the problem of income inequality in Miami, city officials are not addressing the real issue of Miami's climate change, as they should really address the issues of inequality, yet to catering to a small segment of the population, the very rich. We know for sure that 3 factors of climate change is going to affect everyone living in Miami-Dade County: higher seas, increased heat as the temperature of the Gulf and the Caribbean Sea rise, and intensifying storms. If the ocean rises just 2 feet, 15% of the water of the landmass of South Florida will be underwater and uninhabitable. Miami has a serious poverty and working poor situation, with many facing the grim reality of over 70% of their income being allocated towards rent every month. They simply don't have the resources to prepare for the weather shocks of Miami's climate catastrophe. They don't have the savings and resources like the rich do to wait and see, to adopt a wait and see attitude towards climate change. Over 1/5 of the residents of Miami live below the poverty line. These gross inequities need to be addressed by local government authorities if they're going to brace and deal with the inevitable consequences of climate change. Environmental racism is becoming more of a serious threat to many African Americans in Miami. There are urban heat zones that are disproportionately confined to black neighborhoods near the airport, truck stops, and grocery truck depots, and where it makes air almost unbreathable and highly polluted. In areas west of downtown Miami, where industrialized zoning endangers the lives of so many African American young boys and girls who can only afford to live in dilapidated housing units that lack the shelter and air filtering of large trees and air conditioning. If you drive through some of Miami's most wealthy neighborhoods, such as Coconut Grove, there's so many large trees and lots of foliage that help to filter the air and lessen the impact of climate change and industrialization. The city of Miami needs to come to grip with the effects of Jim Crow laws that impoverish Miami communities and the horrible past of bulldozing through Miami neighborhoods to make highways. The day of reckoning is coming to Miami, and it's a lot nearer than most people want to believe. One of the first effects of climate change well before 2050 will be in the integrity of fresh drinking water supply. If Miami suffers from a major hurricane with a surge of 12 inches or more, the integrity of hundreds of thousands of septic tanks could be in jeopardy, as these septic tanks become inoperable when the groundwater rises along with the rising seas. The cost of building a new sewage system could be in the neighborhood of over $5 to $7 billion in Miami, but that doesn't account to the real expense of the fees to connect each household, which could be anywhere from $12,000 to $25,000 to this new system. The septic tanks have to be a major issue in city politics if there's going to be a solution to climate change. So many residents are rent burdened in Miami. Many residents of Miami simply don't have the financial resources to stand up to the situation of the impending climate catastrophe. So the only way for Miami to really address the issues of climate change is to bridge the gap of racial and income inequalities in the city. Resilience tactics such as raising the road in mostly wealthy neighborhoods a few centimeters and installing giant pumps is not the answer. The city of Miami needs to think about relocating some of its most vulnerable and at-risk residents to higher ground and offer people incentives to relocate away from coastal line areas to lessen the impact of climate change on the most vulnerable sections of Miami's population. This has been a climate change documentary by Bow to Weather. Please like and subscribe and share with your friends and family, and especially residents of the Magic City who are facing this calamity and need to increase their education and awareness about the elements of Miami's climate change catastrophe and brace for the impact of rising seawater, increased heat, and intensifying hurricanes and turbulent weather in the South Florida region. The hurricane season of 2020 is only a sign of things to come for the future, and Miami is caught right in the middle of Hurricane Alley with nowhere to run. Spread the word, and hopefully some lives will be saved. Climate change is real. Austerity and resiliency measures are not the solution. They're only short-term patches on a much bigger problem. Only policy and protection of the most vulnerable segments of the population in Miami would save lives and help to preserve and protect the community. Thank you, and please be safe, and don't forget to bow to weather.